Good morning and welcome everybody to the Hope One Show. We're back. It is your host Jorge Hill. Frank is not here again, so we're gonna take care of you. We got J. Warner Wallace today talking about hope from the history of the arts. But before I bring Jim in, I want to ask everybody who are watching to make sure to share this stream. We are on Facebook, 3 different pages. Frank Turek, Cross Examine, and J. Warner Wallace page. Just make sure you share this or tag somebody that will benefit from this stream. Also, make sure that you tag people or share it on your YouTube channel. And if you're watching from the app, if you want to participate in the Q&A at the end of this session, make sure that you make your way to any of the social media platforms that we are broadcasting from. Now, number 2. The reason why Frank is not here is because he went down to Florida to visit his dad. It's not related to the coronavirus, but we do want to pray for Frank's dad for his health. So if you can join us in prayer and pray for Frank, for his wife, and they are down there in Florida, and for his dad, we will really appreciate these. And without further ado, I'm going to bring in our guest, Jay Warner Wallace, and he's going to tell us what all of this is about. Jim.
Well, thanks for letting me be part of this, right? I mean, Frank talked to me about coming on a couple of weeks ago. Actually, we had planned on doing something, and we just talked about, well, what would give us hope, right, in a situation? And of course, our prayers are with Frank also. It seems like when we're about close to my age, you're younger than us, okay, Jorge? But
a little bit.
You also know how it is to have a dad that you're concerned about, and we all, our parents are getting older. So yeah, I think we all want to be in prayer for Frank and for Stephanie, and just to kind of know that we're all in the same boat. We get to a certain age. I'm coming up on 60 in a couple of years, and I'm like, okay, so my dad now is not, I still think of myself as the kid, right?
Absolutely.
My dad is the dad, but the reality of it is, we're all getting older, so I think it's important to be praying for Frank. But What I wanted to do today is take a kind of a weird twist for somebody who, like Frank and I, were constantly making a case for Christianity. We consider ourselves to be Christian case makers. But we don't often talk about some of the other things that are so powerful about the Christian worldview that might give us hope beyond just the evidence that it's true. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do this morning is talk a little bit about the nature of our worldview, Christianity, and the impact it's had on the world that has provided hope and inspiration and has been the igniter for our imagination and creativity. Look at it this way. We are in a worldview that is uniquely creative in the sense that we believe there's a God who is a creator and has designed us in his image. And in that image, we also are inclined and inspired to create. This is part of our nature, being created in the image of God, who is a creator. Now, I would say that God commands us to do a lot of things, most of which involves service to him and service to others, worship of him and loving others. And that's an important part of who we are, of course. It's our marching order. Mm-hmm. But we're also commanded to be creative in a certain sense. I'll tell you what, give you an example. We are called to sing hymns and spiritual songs. Well, even if you were to take just maybe the Psalms and use those as the lyrical, as the lyrics of your hymns, or you were to kind of look at the pages of scripture from Paul or notes from Paul or letters from Paul as your source of inspiration, maybe use 1 Timothy 3, or you sing from the 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. These are kind of early creeds of the church. You're still going to have to create musical notation to go along with the lyrical inspiration of scripture. You're going to find yourself creating. And here we are it seems that if you look at the history of Christianity, we have been the most creative and inspired to be the most creative when we have been challenged. If you look at the creativity, and I'll show you in a second, in the first century, you'll see those folks were challenged in a way that we are not challenged even today, even in the midst of the coronavirus. Yet they were inspired to create. And so the hope this gives us, and by the way, our creative work gives us hope for the future. We imagine and create images and music of a perfect world sometimes. You see even now, you'll get utopian visions of the future. You'll get dystopian visions of the future. But the fact that we are inspired to create, I think, gives us hope. Here's what I want to do with you this morning. I want to show you the powerful way in which Christianity and the Christian worldview has inspired us. And I'm going to do this visually with you. So
Awesome.
I'm going to jump into a presentation here, and Jorge and I have been working on this back and forth. So look, nobody's got this mastered more than Jorge, but the problem sometimes is the software is the tail that wags the dog. So even you've got somebody who's in the saddle and knows exactly which way to lead the horse, doesn't mean the horse is always going to go there. So let's try this, and we'll see how far we get. I want to show you the powerful way in which Jesus has impacted the world. So I'm just going to switch over to a presentation here real quick with Jorge, and we're just going to jump right in. All right. So if you think about it just in terms of the way that that this has kind of exploded on the scene, there's an impact that Jesus makes on the world. His arrival does not go unnoticed. In fact, I would argue that there are four ways that Jesus changed everything as a fallout. Imagine if a bomb was to explode at the turn of this millenniums, and you would have a fallout from that explosion known as Jesus of Nazareth. When he came on the scene, he created a tidal wave of inspiration and a tidal wave of change. And I think you'll see this in four categories. And the fallout, by the way, explains who Jesus is. I think you'll see this, number one, in the fact that so much is written about Jesus after the fact. You'll also see that so much inspiration, that's what we're going to talk about today. You'll also see that education and science is forever changed by the arrival of Jesus of Nazareth, and that every other worldview, theistic worldview, ends up bending its knee to Jesus of Nazareth as well. But all we're going to do today is just talk about this one section here, which is imagination. Because this is where I think we can get some hope. I want to inspire you to, during this pandemic time, to be hopeful and to be creative. I see this all the time right now. I was watching a video yesterday of a young lady who owns a hairstyle shop, and she's a hairstylist, and she's trying to be creative about how to reopen given her conditions there in her state. And I'm watching how she's got people coming in and what they have to do to get in and how she's serving them. And I'm thinking, man, this is really creative. We can't help but be creative. And our ingenuity is exercised during times of trial. And that gives me hope that we are still created in the image of God, reflecting his beauty and his imagination. So let me jump back and show you. If you look at the first century, right, you will see, and let's just kind of imagine a time clock here, and we'll put Jesus at the center of it. If you imagine through the course of time over the centuries, in the earliest days, there weren't a lot of people in the Christian faith to begin with. It started very, very small, as you know. So without a large population and without the kind of position, like Judaism at least had a position in the empire, even though it wasn't a great position, other worldviews, religious worldviews had a position, but the Christians didn't. They also lacked property. These people didn't own like temples and places of worship yet. And they also lacked patronage. There wasn't anybody who was like big donors who were coming in and saying, hey, we will sponsor your creative works. And finally, they lacked permission. They didn't have permission from the government to even really claim that Jesus was the only God. And finally, they didn't have the protection so that whatever they would create wouldn't be destroyed. Imagine trying to create art, trying to create inspiration, being inspired to create art in this environment. We know that this is the generation that was persecuted for their beliefs. As a matter of fact, we know this historically because we can read it on the pages of history. Tacitus tells us that they were accused and executed. Suetonius says they were punished. And Pliny the Younger will talk about, hey, if they didn't bend their knee to the Roman gods and claim them as their own, they would be either punished or persecuted if they persisted. It's in this context that we see tons of people dying for what they believed, including all of these kind of well-known Christians over the course of history. That's why we call this the age of Christian martyrdom. It's under these emperors that Christians consistently were persecuted. Some were executed. I would think in this kind of an environment, you know what I would expect in terms of art? Not much. I would expect there to be very little in an age when you don't have a lot of people to begin with, not any position within the empire, don't have any property to paint on or to sculpt with, you don't have any patronage, permission, or protection. Yet, what do we see? I'm going to show you what we see, how creative we are as Christians, even under persecution. If you look at just the earliest centuries of the Christian worldview, of Christianity, what you're going to see in the earliest centuries is a robust representation of Christian art. This is just some of it you'll see, all before Christianity is made the religion of the empire. I'm surprised to find anything, yet you will find interesting things about Jesus early in history, through the earliest ages. Now, why would that be the case? I think you see this. Like, why would people be so inspired to paint, etch, draw Jesus, given that they had to do it in the catacombs, in places where it was secret? You see, most of the earliest artwork created by Christians is in catacombs. But why would they still, knowing this could cost them, that they find this artwork, it's going to cost them something, why would they still persist to do it? Well, I'll show you. I think part of it is, you'll see it right here in the statements of people like Justin Martyr, who says, hey, you can kill us, but you can't really do us any real harm. Let's just go to the Dark Ages. What do you see? You see an explosion. The Dark Ages were not dark from a Christian art perspective. They weren't. They were robustly full and complete with images. These are the most famous images that I'm bringing to you from just the Dark Ages. And if you go one more step to the Renaissance, of course, you have an explosion of art driven, because now by this time you have position, you have property, you have patronage, you have protection and permission. So now we see an explosion. Now we actually have walls and churches to adorn. Now, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because I became interested in this because before I became a cold case detective, and most of you know my work, I work as a cold case detective in Los Angeles. That's how I became a Christian, studying the evidence for Christianity, like a cold case detective would do. But before I became a detective, my background is in design, my bachelor's degree, and then my master's degree is in architecture. So I'm very interested in the history of art and architecture. Also, I was a musician for a number of years, and we played on worship teams, all that stuff. This stuff, I find the creative aspect of who we are, I've always tried to incorporate into my case making, which is why I try to make this visual for you. Let's go back. This is the Renaissance, okay? A lot of stuff going on. But even in the modern era, in which you might think is pretty secular, right? And you might think, well, you know, that what's really happening in the modern era? Is anything happening in the modern era? Yeah. As a matter of fact, a ton is happening in the modern era. It's not as though, even though we're in a secular environment, it's not as though this impacts a number of people who are painting about Jesus. And by the way, you might think, oh, well, Jim, you're just bringing up the history of Western art. Well, you know, let me show you. Actually, if you have an A to Z of all of the countries in the world, you will see that Jesus is painted in all of them A to Z. Now, what's interesting about that is, as you look at this collection of art, you will see that it is very different culturally, one item to the next. In other words, the styles of art, the way they're painted, the materials they're using, the representations of Jesus are contextualized for every country. So here's everything from Argentina to Zimbabwe. And you will see that Jesus is represented more than any other figure who ever lived. In every epic period of history, of every epic period of of art history, and in every country in which art is being done. That's a huge impact. I think about that for a second. He is the most inspirational figure, really, not in the world, in the entire world, not just in the West, in the world. And think about this. There's a lot of other deities that people worship and were actually worshipped both before and after Jesus. Well, guess what? None of these are as represented in art in any context as Jesus. Jesus captures all of it. Now, here's what's really interesting about it. It's not just that he inspires all of us to paint him. It's that if you can actually reconstruct the story of Jesus. So here, for example, is the Gospel of Mark. And what I did is I went through the Gospel of Mark and I identified every major significant story. I've got them all on the screen here. You can barely see them, but this is from the baptism of Jesus all the way down to the resurrection of Jesus along the way. You know, when John is beheaded, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, when he walks up, I just went line by line and I identified what are the chapters and episodes that are represented in the Gospel of Mark. Well, I don't know if you realize this or not, but you can go back. If you lost the Gospel of Mark, if you didn't have any New Testament at all, what would you know about Jesus? Well, if you return to just the art of the ancient period and the Dark Ages, the earliest forms of Christian art, you could reconstruct the entire Gospel of Mark just from art. And that's exactly what I did here. So if you didn't know, you didn't have the Gospels, or you said, I don't trust, well, I don't want to listen, don't use the New Testament. Imagine you don't have a New Testament. Imagine somehow it was completely destroyed. Well, you would know everything that you know in the Gospel of Mark just from studying the art that was produced globally during the ancient period and during the Dark Ages. You're not going to be able to erase the figure of Jesus because he's had that kind of impact on the arts. I got a question for you. Let me show it to you. Here's, I think, an important question. Okay, and this is, I think, fair to ask. What have you in the entire history of humans lived and only had a public ministry for just 3 short years, yet ends up inspiring and being so well documented? What living human has inspired so many artists and craftsmen in just 3 years? Now, look, there's all kinds of people with one name titles in the first century. Here's a bunch of them, right? You know, none of these people inspired this kind of art. And these are people who were emperors and people in important positions. These are philosophers and poets and writers. All of these people combined don't have this kind of impact on the arts, this kind of impact on literature, this kind of impact on music. One person has this kind of impact. Now, let me just go a little step further with it because I love geeked out by the arts. I'm going to show you a couple of things here. Let's go back to our timeline now, okay? I want you to know that in every art genre, if you study the history of art, there are genres of art, from ancient through medieval, then there's all the way to Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. You can go all the way to abstract and Dadaism and Precisionism and Surrealism. These are the major categories of art. If you just Google them, and you say, hey, Google, who are the top 3 artists in this particular category of art history? Pull them up. Then go through their art catalog. Here's what you're going to discover, is that every genre is dominated by artists who have painted Jesus. And many of these were not even Christians. They were just inspired by the story of Jesus. These are the top people in every genre. If you think about art, you'll recognize some of these names. They all drew. They all painted. They all did art related to Jesus. Let me show you another thing. It's not just the art genres. It's that if you look at every innovative style, every epic period, every historic era in which people work, they're going to be painting Jesus. As a matter of fact, look at the masters here. Okay, these are the masters we're talking about, the people who are generally recognized. Look, you might say, well, Jim, I don't know anything about art, and I don't know who the masters of art are. Well, I'll bet you this. You know enough about art to recognize somebody on this list. Look at this list. There's somebody on here that you're going to say, okay, I do recognize that. I know Pablo Picasso. I've heard of Picasso. I've heard of Vincent van Gogh. I've heard of, let's say, I don't know, Caravaggio. I've heard of some of these people. Well, this is the top, this is like the inspirational list of artists over the years. Okay, and there's somebody in this list that you're going to recognize. These are the biggest names on the list, right? If nothing else, you recognize these folks because these are the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles, right? And this is the Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. By the way, they were all named after artists. If you don't know, for example, the purple one is Donatello, the blue one is Leonardo, and the orange one is Michelangelo, and the red one is Raphael, just so you know who your Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are. But my point is, this list right here, all of these folks were absolutely influenced. They were interested in Jesus. They were infatuated with him, informed by him, and inspired by him. And they painted him. Now, what's interesting about this is if you were to go back and look at other theistic worldviews, like say Buddhism. Now, if I was to show you all this Buddha art, I think you might be inclined to say, well, this all came out of the same place, because Buddhism, for whatever reason in the arts, the artists end up drawing Buddha in almost the exact same kind of colorful way. He's modeled the same way. It's very, very rigid. You could look at that and almost think it all came from the same country, even though it didn't. It came from all over the world. He just ends up looking very much the same, no matter where he is sculpted, no matter where he is painted. But that is not true true for Jesus. Christianity is open-handed. It is not a rules-based. It's not restrictive. What it does is it opens up creativity. And in different places in the world, Jesus looks very different because in the context of that artistic genre or that artistic region, he still inspires, but he doesn't limit. Does that make sense? He inspires, but he doesn't limit. And that's what's so cool about Jesus. He inspired art, not just in the West, but he inspired the progress of art in the entire world, regardless of genre. That's the kind of impact that Jesus has had on the arts. Let me show you also, it's not just the arts. When I say the arts, the visual arts, but he also had a huge impact on music. And why would that be? Well, I think it's because music has always been huge within the Judeo-Christian tradition. So, for example, this is a pretty cool song here. If you look at the lyrics, it's got the same kind of lyrical structure you see sometimes even in modern day songs, the way that endures forever is repeated again and again at the end of this. This is sung in many churches today, but of course we know that comes out of Psalm 118. It's not even, it's just basically the lyrics are the words of Psalm 118. This is a very early song written about God. As a matter of fact, this is the song that most people think Jesus was singing with his disciples at the Last Supper in Matthew 26. And there's other songs that you'll find in Scripture as well. You'll see that for example, I mentioned earlier 1 Timothy 3:16. This is a nice lyrical structure of a song, but this is the verse from 1 Timothy, often believed to be either an early song or an early prayer or an early creed of Christian. You'll see others that are similar to this as well. For example, here, this I think has got very much potential as a song, right? And this is considered to be perhaps an early song of the Christian church from 1 Peter 2. Now, what's interesting about this as a case maker for me is that we could reconstruct. Remember I showed you how we could reconstruct everything you need to know about Jesus just from the art, the visual art that's been created about Jesus in the most ancient periods? Well, look at this. Something similar happens here. So remember I showed you how we're going to reconstruct Jesus. Even if we lost the New Testament, even if we lost the Gospels, we could reconstruct the story of Jesus from visual arts. Well, the same thing can be said from music. If we just look at the songs and hymns that were sung by the earliest Christians while Christianity was still not the religion of the empire, was still under persecution, if we just, and here they are, by the way, is that you can identify these. There's a bunch of these. These are the earliest hymns sung. You see the dates there. They go back. I stopped them around the 400s. So you can. I'm just going to now give you a summary. What would you know about Jesus just from these hymns? You lost the New Testament. You've got no Gospels. But what could you reconstruct about Jesus just from the earliest hymns? Well, pretty much everything related to his birth and everything related to his ministry. You're not going to lose any of that. All of this is repeated in the hymns that were sung by the earliest Christians. And about his mission and what he was here to do, well, guess what? You're going to capture all that back again as well. As a matter of fact, the great thing about hymns is they're deeply theological. So although you get data, the data related, for example, related to his death is all repeated in the hymns, and all the data related to his resurrection and return is all repeated in the hymns. But you also get his titles, the titles that are used to describe Jesus. And you get theologically, which is pretty cool, you get his entire nature. That is, I think, really an interesting truth, is that you are not going to erase, but if you combine the earliest songs sung about Jesus and the earliest visual art done about Jesus, you're going to be able to recreate everything. Now, it's not just, though, that you can recreate the story of Jesus. It's like in the arts. It's that Jesus has the greatest impact any one singular person has ever had on the discipline. So if you look at the periods now, this is what is typically described as the history of music. Is the same way the history of visual arts is broken into epic periods. The history of music is broken typically into, these are not the Christian divisions, these are what music historians will say. Now, if you were to go back in each one of these periods and ask, who is the innovator? Who is innovating music in these historic periods of music? I think you know what you're going to find. you're going to find Christians are the innovators. And they are contributing in a way that is way oversized, way oversized. And so if you look at their contributions, they are really amazing what they contribute. And so these are the Christians who are contributing. And what are they contributing? Well, they're contributing all kinds of little advances in music, the way that you hear it today, just the way that you hear it, the way that people all over the world, because we are now living in a world in which Spotify basically puts, and whatever's put out on Spotify has global impact. It's not just, it has Western impact. The top songs listened to here are often the same songs, like movies, that are listened to in China. So you got the kind of media impact globally. And all of these elements of modern music did not exist until these groups brought them into existence. It's pretty, I mean, I don't want to like beat up and go too deeply into each one of these innovations, but every innovation could kind of be listed, you know, from the way that we even started to write musical notation. Nobody was writing musical notation about music. It was all passed on from memory. Melody was passed on from memory one generation to another until a Christian invented musical notation. The harmonizing, the instrumentation behind voices, major and minor scales, all of this stuff, what brought into reality related to music by Christians. Now, why is that interesting? They led the way. I want to show you. You're listening to something right now. Here's you listening to your music. Now, I don't know what you're listening to. I don't know what you like. But you like something, and I guarantee you're indebted to a Christian, regardless of what genre of music you are listening to. Why? Because in the time you listen to music that looks like this. The music you're listening to is got these elements right now. And I don't care if you're listening to hip hop or you're listening to country or you're listening to I don't care what your genre is. You're listening to classical music. I don't care what your genre is. These are the rough elements, the nature of music you're listening to. Now, it turns out there's a long runway before you came along in which Christians contributed all of these elements systematically. In fact, it's on the basis of these historic contributions that you now have a form of music that is the kind of music you're listening to right now. Now, what are you listening to? That's the question. Let me show you something that I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, I did a search on Billboard, on Rolling Stone magazine, on IMDb, of the top 100 artists in the last century. Top 100. Now, everyone's list is slightly different, so you end up with more than 100. Okay, but I just wanted to show you the list of what are typically seen. And here it is. These are the people who are typically seen as somewhere in the most historic bands. Actually, this isn't that list. This is something I wanted to do a little bit earlier. This is a list of just Christian artists. Some of you out there listen to Christian music. Okay, you do. And this is a list of the top Christian artists. These are just the flat out professing Christians, okay? Who, if you listen to worship or contemporary Christian music, you know, CCM, you're listening to this. Our good friend Elisa Childers, Zoe Girl, I think is on this list. Yes, there it is, in the very bottom of the list on the far right-hand side. So this is a list of all just this is the kind of impact that Jesus has had on music within Christianity. But now let's go to outside. I don't listen to Christian music, Jim. I listen to really good music. I hear people say this all the time. Your Christian music, I don't like that. I listen to only secular artists. Fine. Here's the list of secular artists that are listed in the top Billboard, Rolling Stone, and IMDb. Here they are. Whoever your favorite band is, or you probably have somebody at least on this list that you would say, yeah, I like that guy, or I like that girl, or I like that band. Okay, great. Look at this list now. I want to show it to you. Do you realize on this list, every one of these people has sung a song about Jesus? There is nobody in the history of pop music. And by the way, a lot of these people are flat out not Christians and are hostile to Christianity. Let me show you some of one of my favorites on here, okay? I like the Stooges, Jesus Loves the Stooges, or Smokey Robinson did one called Jesus Told Me to Love You. Nirvana did Jesus Doesn't Want Me for a Sunbeam. Aerosmith did Street Jesus. This is my favorite right here by Frank Zappa. Jesus Thinks You're a Jerk. That's the name of the song, all right? So I don't care who it is you're listening to in music. That person you're listening to in music was influenced by Jesus. Jesus influences, informs, inspires, instructs, incites. Sometimes people infuriate some people, invigorates others. But the point is, no one has been as influential. As a matter of fact, let me show you something else that's kind of interesting. I don't care what award show or what competition show you're watching, if it's America's Got Talent or it's whatever it is. The people who dominate those shows. Well, here's American Idol. American Idol. This back on there again, and it's got a rich, long history with here in our country and in other countries as well. Let me show you season 1 of American Idol. Here are the cities that season 1 actually drew from. Now, these are not all the most Christian cities in America. Would you agree? A lot of these are probably some amongst the least Christian cities in America. But who was the winner? The winner was Kelly Clarkson, a committed, outspoken Christian. She sang in her youth group before she entered the competition. Season 2, same kind of thing, right? I mean, a little bit more. I mean, it's kind of still the most Christian cities in Nashville is, I'm sure, but Reuben Studdard, another Christian. As a matter of fact, if you look at the first 11 seasons, you will see that who wins, I think all but 3 of these are outspoken Christians. And the other 3 were raised within Christianity, although I'm not sure where they stand today. That's just interesting to me. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the other winners and the other runners-ups, you're going to find that it's dominated. Why? Why would this show and other shows like it, because they happen to be no, it's more than just being in the West. It's that they come from a Western tradition that Jesus founded, in which Jesus sang, and then he encouraged his followers to sing, and then they served as the inspiration for everyone who followed them. And guess what? We provided an environment every single week in which you've got a stage to sing on. So no kidding. It turns out that most people who are singing publicly probably started in a church in which they were singing in front of what other worldview provides you with the environment in which you can refine your creative skills in front of a live audience every week. That's part of who we are as a culture. So before I finish this with you, I just want to show you something that's even grander, because remember, my background is in architecture. So let's take a look at how this began architecturally. Here it is. So it starts off with, this is a studio, typical artist studio. Wouldn't you all like to have a studio like that? I always think when I see this picture, man, I wish I had a studio like that, right? But this isn't the studio in which art sprang, in which art that we know it sprang. It actually sprang from something much simpler. House churches. Churches in the first century, houses in the first century, in which people gathered to worship. Now, here's the problem with this kind of a house. The problem with this kind of a house is that it's not big enough, and it has to be constructed in a way. I don't know if you think about architecture and building, but all the project in architecture is to bring weight to the ground. How we build is we bring weight. So, for example, in a structure like this, where you have a roof you have to support, I got to figure out a way to get the weight of that roof down to the ground. And that means if I got a window, for example, I got to figure out a way to get around the window. And that's why a lot of these early buildings did not have the kinds of windows. They were, to be honest, relatively dark spaces, because they needed these thick walls to carry weight from the roof down to the ground. Does that make sense? So in the end, these are not the perfect places to worship God, because number one, the lighting is pretty lame, and Jesus is supposed to be the light. I'm the light of the world, right? Light shines in the darkness, and darkness does not comprehend it. Well, it sounds like the whole environment seems dark, and that's another problem. The environment does not seem like you're like in this dungeon. You're not in a place that seems to be, heavenly or divine. It doesn't reflect heaven. It seems like it reflects the earth rather than heaven. So you start to see changes in the way people are worshiping in their environment. They are looking for a space that reflects their Savior and reflects their salvation. Lighting and in the environment needs to change. So what happens? Well, you start to see these things become bigger. And as they open them up, they have to, because they need more space to seat people. And so that's the biggest function. And here's another problem with that. So I still got to put a roof on this. And when I put the roof on it, I got to figure out a way to get the weight to the ground. This is the project of all architecture. How do I get the weight to the ground? So it ends up with massive walls with just tiny windows are kind of the rule of the day in these Romanesque early ancient worship spaces. But that's not what they wanted. Trust me, they wanted something better than this. They would like it to be lighter and more heavenly. They want it to be bigger so they can fit more people. So what do they start doing? They start creating naves on the side. They start pushing the walls further out and having support walls on the inside. Early churches are looking like this. And now you've got a place to sit people outside those arches on the sides of the room. You can put benches in there. You can seat people there. Now you've got these big heavy walls, but at least these walls are supporting the roof. And I've got a wall that's even to the side of those, and I can seat in between. But the only problem is going to be it's still a relatively heavy space, and you can't see anything from over there, So what are you going to do? Well, early designers thought, well, what if we could do something different? What if we could change the seating, make it bigger, change the environment so it's more heavenly, and lighten it up so it's not so dark and reflects our Savior. Size, salvation, Savior. So what happens? Well, we think, okay, the seating, we can make it bigger. We kind of got that taken care of. We've added some side naves. Okay, fine. Well, what about the ceiling? Can we do anything with that to make it heavenly rather than this dark wooden structure? Can we do anything to make the walls lighter? What if we could get a space in which we could change the ceiling to inspire heaven and change the walls to make them light? Do you see what that's going on here? This is what's happening is that people are trying to make the space more conducive to worshiping God and from a Christian worldview. Well, the first thing they did was they started working on ceilings. And you'll see that some of the earliest churches have an amazing collection of ceilings in which they're trying to inspire, to teach by way of art. And if you look at this through the course of history of architecture within Christianity, you will see a more extravagant, more robust, more amazingly inspirational ceilings, domes. Dome architecture and engineering was really made perfect by Christians who used these domes to inspire. Now, I'll give you an example. This is the inside of St. Peter's. Now, St. Peter's is a very interesting architectural challenge. So this desire to create, this desire to be creative required a certain technological advance. And here, for example, you'll see that the structure here is actually quite sophisticated, given the age in which it's built. And you had to control lighting, and there's some double walls going on here. You'll see, and the structure is very challenging to begin with, but then you've got opportunities to create and control light the way it comes in through those small windows, so that you can create an environment that is inspiring. And you'll see that in early Christendom, all of this became like a dome dominant. And you'll see on a landscape of any early Christian city, you'll see these domes. Why? Well, you see it in Scripture, right? You see this in the book of Acts, that everyone kept feeling a sense of awe, and many wonders and signs were taking place through the apostles. And what they're trying to do architecturally is to create that sense of awe. So ceilings were an important goal for any architect within Christendom. That doesn't explain, though, the walls. The walls are still dark and heavy if they're going to support these huge dome structures. So how do we change that? Well, let's go to a drawing here real quick, then I'll show you what this looks like. The heavy walls that would support a roof in the beginning needed to change. So what happened was you started to think, well, what can I do? Because right now, this is that dark, heavy interior. I don't want that. I want something lighter. Well, what if we took the wall and we built a secondary wall inside that wall? Now, the outside wall can support the roof, but the inside wall would be lighter and could even it could be made of glass. And then you have this new kind of glass structure that sits inside a heavier structure on the outside. You're not limited now in terms of the kind. And so what if we did that even bigger? What if we made that even larger? Add one more set of taller glass walls. I mean, could you imagine what this space might look like if it's supported on the outside? The weight is supported outside externally, like an exterior structure, and then the inside could be this light. And by the way, what's great about this is that it's designed in such a way that no matter where a single individual is standing, he is exposed to windows. So this feels on the inside like a much lighter structure. Well, this is how they did it. They created what are called flying buttresses, and flying buttresses are the exterior wall supporting the weight. It's just divided into these buttresses, and then the inside walls are built with glass. So this is your weight support, and this is your glass structure. And what this does is it provides you with a way to do art on the interior that you never were able to do before because you can do stained glass. And now these structures become just an entire museum of art. And as they progressed, they became more and more extravagant. And some of these are just spectacular. Now, compare this to how they started. This doesn't have the seating you need. This doesn't have the environment you want or the lighting you want. But this certainly does. This accomplishes all of it. These are spaces that were created within Christendom so that music and art can flourish. Singing and art can flourish. And they're all inspired by one man. And they actually confirm his existence and his deity if you actually start paying attention to the art and the music that's being sung. Now, look, let's go back and I'll wrap it up here. The impact that Jesus had on history. Now, we didn't talk about literature, but I'll just give you a review of literature right now. Literature was a huge, he inspired literature. The earliest believers, they wrote about him, and they confirmed all of the writings of the eyewitnesses. These are not eyewitnesses. These are people who sat at the feet of the eyewitnesses, and they confirm everything that the eyewitnesses said. Even the people who liked Jesus but did not like Christianity, they wanted to change it, right? These are the non-canonical gospels. Well, it turns out they have to affirm certain details about Jesus even as they twist the story of Jesus. And even those who did not like Jesus at all, the hostile non-Christians who wrote about him, they confirmed the story of Jesus. And then as time progresses, people write about Jesus in robust ways over the next 10 centuries. And they continue to affirm the claims that are told earlier. Then we get into the modern era, and guess what? We end up making movies and writing screenplays and that affirm the story of Jesus. And even to the point where there are a ton of stories out there in which Jesus is mentioned as a Christ figure. This is the impact he's had on literacy. No one has ever had this kind of impact on literacy and on literature as Jesus of Nazareth. He is by far the greatest. And you already know from today, he is also the greatest force for artistry, not just in those epic periods of time, but also to every nation, in every genre, and every master. He's had this kind of impact. In terms of music, I showed you today the impact he's had on musicianship. Every single epic period of time is dominated by Christians who innovated and created today what you have in contemporary music. That it's being sung even now, often by people who are not Christians. So if you add these two things together, you'll see the impact that Jesus has had in the arts, from literature to visual arts to music. Tell me, what person of interest in the history of interesting persons could cause that kind of reaction?